Welcome to DEFCON 3. I'm KT McFarland. President Obama's interview this week, in which he said that the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, underestimated the threat posed by the Islamic State militant group. Well, it's raising a lot of concerns over whether the United States does have reliable intelligence on the ground in the fight against ISIS. For analysis on U.S. strategy, we're joined by retired General Garner. He was the former director of the Office for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance in Iraq in the early days of the Iraq War. Welcome, General. It's great to have your analysis and expertise again. So what do you think? Did the president just not get very good intelligence on ISIS?
Well, KT, I don't understand how they missed it, because I was over there last October, November of last year, and then January, February of this year. And when I was over there in November, the black flags of ISIS were flying over Mosul, and you had to pay ISIS to get into Mosul. And then when I was there in January, February, ISIS had moved into Ramadi, Fallujah, and parts of Tikrit. So it was evident then that ISIS was there. And then the Kurds sent a delegation to talk to the White House, the Defense Department, State Department, etc., in late May, early June, to explain everything to them. So how they were caught by surprise, I don't know. I don't think they were. I think we're just making an excuse.
Making excuses for being caught flat-footed, maybe. Let me ask you, General, so have you looked at the president's policy for dealing with ISIS? He's playing catch-up ball, but have you looked at the policy and strategy, and do you think it'll work?
Well, when I listened to him make his speech about what we were going to do, it was built around defeating and decimating ISIS, and then us supplying air strikes and boots on the ground from other countries. None of that's working right now. We're not defeating and decimating right now. We're in an operation of containment, not destruction. And we're running air operations when we should be running a very, very volatile air campaign. And the only time we've come close to that was with the Tomahawk strikes, followed up by the fighter bomber strikes last week. And then, no matter, even if you go to an air campaign, which we must, if we're going to be successful, you got to put boots on the ground, but nobody's putting boots on the ground. And I think that's because we have a very complex coalition that's being put together. You've got 5 Sunni Arab nations that are assisting in the airstrikes, and what they're doing is largely symbolic, by the way. But they're assisting in the airstrikes in Syria. And now they're working in Syria because they'll fight ISIS in Syria because it takes the pressure off the Syrian rebel groups that are fighting Assad. And of course, they want to see the downfall of Assad because he's an Alawite, an offshoot of Shia Muslim. And they want the Shia influence in Syria to be defeated so they can make that a Sunni state. They don't come into Iraq because in Iraq, they don't fight ISIS there because ISIS is fighting the Shia militants in Iraq, who are the enemies of the Sunni Arabs, and they're fighting the Iranians, who are also enemies of the Sunni Arabs. So they'll work in Syria, but they won't work in Iraq. Now we got the European allies that come in. They're doing some things in Iraq, but yet they're doing nothing in Syria yet because they say they have to have the UN to approve that. So it's a very, very confusing coalition, and none of them are putting boots on the ground. And then we say, okay, we're doing this because we now have an inclusive government in Baghdad, which we do not. An inclusive government is a myth. Al-Abadi, the new PM, is cut from the same cloth as al-Maliki. And before the parliament would make him the PM, they sent a delegation to Tehran to get the Ayatollah to approve him. They didn't send a delegation to Washington to get Obama to approve. They sent it to Tehran. So you don't have an inclusive government there. The government hadn't been put together. And then our entire policy is confused. I don't even think you could understand it if you worked in the White House. What we need to do, KT, is we need to have a clear, simple strategy. And I'll tell you what it needs to be. We need to say, number one, we lost over 5,000 lives, soldiers, in Iraq, and spent billions of our dollars in Iraq. Number two, the ISIS problem is a far greater problem to the Iranians, the Turks, and the Arab Sunni nations than it is to us. Number three, we will guarantee the survival of Kurdistan, and we will ensure that they survive because their goals and values are the same as ours. And we will turn to Turkey, Iran, and the Arab Sunni nations and say the ISIS problem in both Syria and Iraq is your problem. You clean it up. If you don't clean it up, you can face the consequences. We're going to take care of Kurdistan. Case closed.
All right, so in other words, we would crawl out of the snake pit that's the Middle East and all these different fighting groups that you've articulated. We crawl out of the snake pit, we close the lid, let them work it out, and then presumably take any snake that slithers out on its way to the United States and we kill it, but at the same time we support Kurdistan. Does that make sense?
That makes great. I wish you was president. You could explain that to everybody. They'd understand that.
Well, let's talk for a minute about Iran. And assuming that in about 3 months' time the president is going to have a choice. You're right, this coalition isn't going to work, and if the Iraqi army doesn't stand up, and if the Syrian moderate rebel group doesn't turn out to be an army, then if the president's faced with three options, either get out, put big U.S. boots on the ground, or I think most likely turn it over to Iran. What price would Iran extract for bailing us out in the Middle East?
I don't think we should let them extract any price. It's their problem. They cannot afford to have a Sunni caliphate on their border. They can't do that. They only have two Arab allies in the world. Number one is Syria, which they've had since 1973, and the second one is Iraq, which they've had since Maliki became the PM. They can't afford to lose either one of those, and they'll lose them to ISIS unless we force them to fight against ISIS. And I would play to our strengths, not our weaknesses, and I see us right now playing to our weaknesses.
So what are our strengths?
Our strengths are telling them that their problem is ISIS. It's not our problem right now. Like you say, if they start crawling toward the United States, we'll chop their head off. But if you don't like the situation over there, you put your boots on the ground and you solve it. We will take care of Kurdistan. It's a democratic country. It's freely elected. It has great economic value to it. It's in the most strategic location in the Middle East for us. And that's what we ought to walk out of there, and that would be a win.
If we walk out, I mean, doing what you're saying, support Kurds, they become Kurdistan, they become an independent, standalone country, what happens then in the Middle East? Does it just get embroiled in 30 years of civil war, multi-party, various groups fighting various groups for another decade or two?
Oh, I think we're there already. I think that's right where we are right now. It just continues. But what will happen is there will have to be some sort of accommodation between the Iranians and the Arabs to contain ISIS or to defeat ISIS. And we ought to force that rather than making them force us to contain or defeat ISIS.
So in the past, they've been very good at holding our coats while we've done the fighting.
That's right. Absolutely. Well put.
General Garner, thank you very much for joining us on DEFCON 3, and come back again. I'm sure this story is not over. That's it for DEFCON 3. Thanks, General.